Imagine stepping into a world where science and ideology collide in the darkest of ways, where a man's curiosity becomes a weapon, and where innocence is treated as an experiment. This was the reality of Josef Mengele, the infamous figure history remembers as the Angel of Death. At Auschwitz, one of the most notorious concentration camps of the Second World War, Mengele carried out medical procedures that defied every boundary of morality and humanity. His focus was not merely on medicine, it was on genetics, twins, and the twisted vision of creating a perfect race according to Nazi ideology. But what does it really mean to be called the Angel of Death? For those who survived the camps, this title was not just a name, it was a symbol of fear and suffering. Mengele's work involved cruel experiments on prisoners, often children, conducted without consent and under the pretense of scientific research. His obsession with twins was not mere fascination. It was methodical, calculating, and deeply rooted in the Nazi obsession with racial purity. Every procedure, every observation, every test was a step toward fulfilling a vision that considered human life as expendable material for experimentation. Yet behind the chilling statistics and historical records lies a story that demands closer examination. Who was the man behind the myth? What drove him to commit acts that are now etched into the darkest chapters of history? And perhaps most importantly, how did he manage to evade justice for decades after the fall of the Third Reich? These questions are not just about recounting facts, they are about understanding the human capacity for cruelty, the mechanisms of power, and the lessons we must carry forward to prevent history from repeating itself. In this video, we will explore the complex and horrifying life of Josef Mengele, tracing his journey from the laboratories of Auschwitz to his escape and life in South America. We will uncover how he eluded capture, how intelligence agencies pursued him across continents, and how the shadows of his actions still echo in the stories of survivors. Through careful research, survivor testimonies, and historical analysis, we aim to shed light on the truths of a life that has fascinated, horrified, and instructed generations. As we dive into this story, it is important to remember that history is not just about names and dates, it is about people, lives, and the moral lessons embedded in the past. We invite you to join us on this journey, to witness, reflect, and learn from one of history's most infamous figures. If you find value in uncovering these historical truths and understanding the profound lessons they carry, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By doing, you help us continue bringing stories from the past that educate, inspire, and remind us why remembering history matters. Stay with us as we unravel the life and legacy of Josef Mengele, a man whose actions changed the course of countless lives, and whose story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideology unbound by morality. As the final months of the Second World War drew to a close, Europe was engulfed in turmoil, cities lay in ruins, and armies moved in disarray across a continent fractured by violence. Within this chaos, Josef Mengele, the man whose name would later become synonymous with terror, found himself facing a reckoning that few could escape. Auschwitz, the camp where he had exercised control over life and death, was no longer a fortress of fear for him, it was a place of imminent danger. The Red Army advanced, liberating the prisoners who had endured unimaginable suffering, while the remaining officers and collaborators scattered in panic, each seeking a path away from accountability. It was in this maelstrom that Mengele, guided by a mixture of cunning and luck, slipped away from the camp just 10 days before liberation, a shadow among the throngs of displaced and desperate people, blending into a world that had no clear lines of authority. The escape was not simply a matter of walking out a gate. It was a calculated navigation through a landscape of suspicion, chaos, and opportunity. Mengele moved through Germany, his family connections and knowledge of the terrain giving him a temporary shield from immediate capture, while the Allied forces focused on securing territories and rounding up prominent figures whose identities were more visible. In the streets and towns he passed, survivors of the camps were emerging from hiding, attempting to reconnect with lost families, and countless lives were being rewritten in real time. Yet Mengele's presence remained unnoticed. He had no tattoo, no distinguishing marks that would betray him, and he carried the appearance of a man displaced like so many others. This anonymity, combined with a plausible story and the confusion of post-war Germany, allowed him to evade the initial waves of justice that swept across the continent, capturing those whose roles in the atrocities had been undeniable and visible. As he traversed through cities and countrysides scarred by bombings and occupation, Mengele began to formulate a path toward survival beyond Europe. His family, affluent and influential in the German town of Günzburg, provided a support network that was crucial in these early days of flight. Resources, advice, and connections offered him temporary sanctuary while he plotted a more permanent escape. Unlike many of the perpetrators who were caught and tried, Mengele's ability to blend in was enhanced by his intelligence and his capacity to manipulate appearances. He understood that in the post-war confusion, careful planning, patience, and a keen sense of timing could make the difference between arrest and freedom. And he acted with the precision of a man accustomed to control, even in circumstances where control seemed impossible. During this period, the world outside Germany was beginning to grasp the extent of the horrors committed at Auschwitz and other camps. Yet the mechanisms to bring every criminal to justice were limited by geography, bureaucracy, and sheer human exhaustion after years of conflict. Mengele was acutely aware of the stories circulating about trials in Nuremberg, where leading Nazis faced prosecution, and he understood that remaining within Germany meant exposure and eventual capture. This knowledge, coupled with the instincts honed through years of operating within a hierarchical and brutal system, pushed him toward the networks that would later facilitate his passage to South America. It was not a path without risk. The journey required forging contacts with sympathizers and former collaborators, navigating black markets and clandestine routes, and constantly adjusting to the shifting political and military landscape. Yet every step was calculated to maintain freedom at all costs. By the time he left German soil, Mengele had effectively vanished into a larger, more complex world where the pursuit of justice was still in its infancy. His departure marked the beginning of a period that would see him living under assumed identities, moving across borders, and gradually integrating into communities where Nazi ideology had found sympathetic pockets, even far from the sites of his crimes. Despite the relative obscurity of his flight, the psychological weight of the atrocities he had committed followed him. Paranoia and caution became necessary companions in his continued evasion of authorities. Every town he entered, every encounter with locals or other refugees, was measured against the possibility of recognition, arrest, or betrayal, a constant reminder that the shadow of his past remained inescapable even as he physically distanced himself from Europe. Mengele's escape from Auschwitz, therefore, was not merely a flight from immediate danger. It was the opening chapter of a decades-long saga in which one of history's most notorious figures would manage to avoid capture, continuing a life of secrecy and displacement while the world slowly pieced together the full extent of his crimes. It was a combination of timing, intelligence, opportunity, and the chaotic backdrop of post-war Europe that allowed him to elude justice, creating a tension between the pursuit of accountability and the practical limits of post-war enforcement. This period highlights the fragility of social order in times of collapse and underscores the ways in which individuals, even those responsible for heinous crimes, can exploit chaos to secure temporary freedom, setting the stage for the next chapters of their lives. which would unfold thousands of miles away from the devastation they had helped create. Mengele's journey from Auschwitz into the uncertain world beyond is a story not only of escape but of the human capacity for evasion and survival, revealing a chilling interplay between moral atrocity and the mechanisms of flight that history would later attempt to document, understand, and ultimately confront. By the time Josef Mengele arrived in Argentina in 1949, he had traversed a Europe still trembling from the devastation of war, carrying with him the secrets of atrocities that would forever mark him in history. The journey from Germany had been fraught with tension and uncertainty, but Argentina offered a landscape that promised relative stability, a chance to disappear into a society that was at once vibrant and distant from the chaos of post-war Europe. Buenos Aires, with its blend of European charm, bustling neighborhoods, and thriving cultural life, became the backdrop for this new chapter. A city where a man like Mengele could reconstruct a life with remarkable discretion. Within the German expatriate community, which included former soldiers, intellectuals, and those sympathetic to the ideology he once served, he found a network that allowed him to navigate society with a sense of security, blending into the local rhythms while maintaining connections that would later prove instrumental in his elusive existence. Mengele's adaptation to life in Argentina was marked by a careful combination of caution and engagement, as he balanced the need for anonymity with a desire to remain socially connected to those who shared his background and, at times, his past affiliations. His presence among the expatriates was not merely social. It was strategic, offering him both information and influence, allowing him to monitor developments in Europe and to anticipate any efforts that might target him for justice. The city itself, with its lively cafes, theaters, and cultural institutions, provided a veneer of normalcy, masking the undercurrents of fear and vigilance that dominated his daily life. Here, in a land far removed from the immediate consequences of his actions, Mengele could craft an existence that combined routine with the ever-present caution required by a fugitive of international interest, a balance that few could maintain under such extraordinary circumstances. During these years, Mengele's routines and interactions were meticulously calculated. He engaged in commerce, often through businesses connected to machinery and trade, ventures that allowed him both financial independence and plausible reasons for his movement and presence within various communities. Yet beneath this surface of ordinary activity lay a constant awareness of the danger that pursued him, as international authorities, particularly those in Germany and Israel, intensified their efforts to locate figures responsible for wartime atrocities. The kidnapping and trial of Adolf Eichmann, a former colleague and key architect of the Holocaust, underscored the reality that the pursuit of justice extended far beyond the borders of Europe, and that even those who had successfully fled could find themselves the target of determined and resourceful investigators. Each encounter, each movement, required careful consideration, and every social engagement was filtered through a lens of strategic self-preservation, demonstrating an acute understanding of the risks inherent in his newfound freedom. The relative comfort of his Argentine life, however, did not eliminate the psychological weight of the past. Memories of Auschwitz and the suffering he had inflicted were never far from the surface, and paranoia became a constant companion. While he could move among expatriates and engage in familiar cultural practices, he remained vigilant, aware that recognition or betrayal could strike at any moment. The dichotomy of living in a society that permitted him normalcy while simultaneously existing under the shadow of his own notoriety created a tension that defined this period of his life. It was a world in which he could experience the mundane pleasures of daily life cafes, social gatherings, and family interactions while the specter of accountability lingered, shaping decisions and movements in ways invisible to those around him. His network in Buenos Aires was reinforced by friendships with other former Nazis and sympathizers, individuals who provided both practical assistance and a shared understanding of the precariousness of their situation. These connections facilitated not only social integration but also logistical support, from safe houses to introductions within local communities, allowing him to remain both mobile and concealed. Through these relationships, he maintained a form of control over his environment, anticipating threats and mitigating risk in a manner reminiscent of the strategic thinking that had characterized his earlier life. In this sense, Argentina became not just a refuge, but a carefully constructed stage on which he could enact a life that, while outwardly ordinary, was internally dominated by vigilance, calculation, and the ever-present echoes of his past. The juxtaposition of comfort and danger defined his existence in Argentina, illustrating how a man responsible for some of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century could simultaneously live among society without immediate consequence while remaining under a persistent, albeit invisible, pressure from the forces of justice. Buenos Aires offered a measure of freedom and routine. Yet it was a freedom bound by the constant knowledge that the long arm of international investigation might extend at any time. Within this complex environment, Mengele's years in Argentina reveal a portrait of a man navigating exile with remarkable adaptability, exploiting opportunity while avoiding exposure, and constructing a life that balanced the outward appearance of normalcy with the internal reality of a fugitive haunted by both his deeds and the pursuit of those determined to hold him accountable. In many, this period set the stage for the subsequent chapters of his flight, as the networks, strategies, and cautious routines he developed in Argentina would inform his later movements across South America, shaping a life defined by evasion and survival while history gradually closed in. It is a chapter that underscores the intersection of historical context, individual ingenuity, and the enduring consequences of actions that reverberate far beyond the immediate moment, offering lessons about the complexity of human behavior, the persistence of justice, and the capacity of individuals to navigate extraordinary circumstances in pursuit of self-preservation. By the late 1950s, the world had not forgotten the horrors of Auschwitz, and the pursuit of justice had intensified, reaching even the distant streets of Buenos Aires, where Josef Mengele had carved out a precarious life. In 1959, West Germany formally indicted Mengele, a development that shattered any illusion of security he may have maintained and sent ripples of fear through his carefully constructed existence. The indictment charged him with mass murder and the inhumane medical experiments he had conducted on thousands of prisoners, particularly children and twins, whose lives he manipulated in the name of twisted science. For Mengele, who had managed to evade the immediate consequences of war through a combination of strategy, luck, and social networks, this legal declaration was a stark reminder that time and distance could not erase the gravity of his actions, and that the international reach of justice was extending ever closer to him. The news of the indictment reached him not as a distant bureaucratic notice, but as an existential threat, a message that the world outside his Argentine sanctuary was both watching and willing to act. His life, which had until then been marked by a careful blend of routine and secrecy, shifted immediately into heightened vigilance, each movement scrutinized through the lens of potential exposure. He understood that extradition was no longer a theoretical possibility, it was a real and imminent danger that could unravel the fragile threads holding his new life together. The German government, backed by growing international consensus on the prosecution of war criminals, was signaling that even those who had managed to slip through the cracks of post-war chaos would eventually face accountability. A concept that for Mengele had always existed on the periphery, but now loomed directly in front of him. Mengele's reaction to the indictment was not just one of fear but of profound recalibration. He began to assess his vulnerabilities and his limited options with meticulous care. aware that any misstep could lead to capture and extradition. His network of acquaintances and sympathizers became a lifeline, providing intelligence, advice, and temporary safe havens as he navigated this new reality. He understood that West Germany's legal machinery could mobilize across borders, relying on international cooperation to enforce warrants and capture fugitives. And he knew that remaining in Buenos Aires or anywhere in Argentina carried risks that no social connection could entirely mitigate. Every encounter, every social engagement, every public appearance was now a potential exposure, and he adjusted his behavior to reduce his footprint, moving with greater caution and relying on trusted intermediaries to monitor his surroundings and report on any developments. The indictment also had psychological effects, layering fear over the paranoia that had been a constant companion since his flight from Europe. The man who had once exercised near absolute control over life and death within the confines of Auschwitz now found himself stripped of power, rendered dependent on secrecy and the goodwill of others to navigate a world determined to hold him accountable. Nights that had once been filled with relative comfort now carried the weight of anticipation and anxiety, each news report or rumor a possible herald of the forces that were seeking him. This period in his life illustrates the paradox of fugitive existence: freedom in terms of movement and basic comfort, yet constrained by the ever-present possibility of capture, where every decision carries consequences not only for survival but for the continuation of a life already tainted by historical infamy. The international context amplified the danger he faced. Israel, having successfully located and captured Adolf Eichmann just months prior, demonstrated a willingness and capability to conduct operations across borders, tracking former Nazis and ensuring that justice was not limited to German soil. The Eichmann abduction sent a clear signal that the global pursuit of war criminals was intensifying, that sophisticated intelligence operations could reach into areas previously considered safe, and that Mengele, with his notoriety and symbolic significance, was a high-priority target. The Mossad and other investigative bodies were increasingly coordinated in their efforts, combining intelligence gathering, surveillance, and the strategic cultivation of informants to build cases that could culminate in arrests, extraditions, and prosecutions. This growing international pressure transformed Mengele's Argentine sanctuary from a haven into a landscape fraught with risk, where freedom was conditional, fragile, and constantly under threat. Mengele's personal network, however, continued to offer some measure of security, providing connections to other expatriates and former collaborators who had their own incentives to assist him, whether out of ideological sympathy or shared concern for personal safety. Yet even this network could not guarantee immunity, as the legal reach of West Germany and the determination of international agencies were beginning to close in, demonstrating that in the post-war world, mobility and wealth offered only temporary reprieve against the mechanisms of justice. Each contact, each movement, required strategic forethought, and every interaction carried the possibility of exposure or betrayal, turning everyday activities into exercises in risk assessment and calculated discretion. The 1959 indictment thus marks a pivotal moment in Mengele's post-war life, a turning point where the distance from Europe no longer equated to safety, and where the consequences of his past began to manifest in concrete, unavoidable terms. It transformed his existence from one of relative comfort and carefully managed anonymity into a life dominated by vigilance, fear, and strategic maneuvering, where the shadows of justice reached across continents. This period underscores the relentless nature of accountability, illustrating how historical crimes continue to exert influence long after their commission, and how individuals, no matter how resourceful, are ultimately confronted by the weight of their actions in ways that shape both personal destiny and collective memory. In the shadow of the indictment, Mengel's life became a constant negotiation between the desire for freedom and the inescapable pursuit of justice, a delicate balance that would define his years in South America and set the stage for the final chapters of his story. The successful capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina sent shock waves through the global community and reverberated deeply in the hidden life of Josef Mengele, transforming the abstract threat of justice into an immediate and tangible danger. Israeli agents, having demonstrated the extraordinary reach and precision of their intelligence network, turned their attention to the next symbol of Nazi atrocities, identifying Mengele as a high-priority target whose capture would not only deliver justice, but also serve as a powerful statement about the persistence of accountability. The Mossad, armed with both operational experience and lessons learned from Eichmann's apprehension, began meticulous preparations, combining undercover surveillance, local informants, and careful analysis of movement patterns to locate a man who had successfully eluded detection for more than a decade. For Mengele, whose life in Argentina had been a careful exercise in blending into the expatriate community and maintaining plausible routines, the shadow of these new efforts introduced a profound and unsettling tension that would dominate his existence in the coming years. As the news of Eichmann's abduction spread among former Nazis and sympathizers, it became clear to Mengele that the sanctuary he had relied upon was no longer secure, that the forces of justice could reach across borders and operate with a level of sophistication that rendered previous precautions inadequate. The Mossad's methods were both strategic and relentless, relying on intelligence gathered through networks of locals, expatriates, and former collaborators, each piece of information meticulously verified before any action was taken. The agents understood that Mengele's notoriety was both a liability and a tool. It meant that he would be cautious, potentially isolated, and predictable in certain behavioral patterns, but it also required them to operate with extreme precision, as any misstep could alert him to their presence or endanger the broader mission. Surveillance operations were established across multiple locations where Mengele was believed to have spent time, from modest residences on the outskirts of Buenos Aires to social hubs frequented by expatriates, all conducted under the cover of ordinary activity yet guided by an unwavering focus on their elusive target. Mengele, acutely aware of the implications, adjusted his life with a heightened sense of vigilance, viewing each social interaction through a lens of potential exposure and every routine movement as a risk. His days, once punctuated by the relative normalcy of commerce, cultural engagement, and community ties, became exercises in strategic caution as he carefully monitored his surroundings, minimized unnecessary contacts, and relied increasingly on trusted intermediaries to relay information about any suspicious developments. The man who had once wielded almost absolute authority over the lives of those in his care at Auschwitz now found himself constrained by fear, constantly calculating risks and evading detection in a manner reminiscent of his earlier survival instincts, yet shaped by the relentless pressure of modern intelligence operations. Each day was a delicate balance between maintaining appearances and protecting oneself from a system designed to bring the past to account, a life in which every decision carried weighty consequences. The Mossad's pursuit also highlighted the complex interplay between local and international politics, as Argentina had historically provided a haven for former Nazis, and navigating the legal and social landscape required not only operational skill, but also cultural and diplomatic awareness. Agents had to contend with a network of sympathizers, secret agreements, and unofficial channels that could either facilitate or hinder their efforts, requiring a nuanced understanding of local dynamics alongside their intelligence objectives. Surveillance operations were discreet yet comprehensive, involving stakeouts, reconnaissance, and careful monitoring of movements, all coordinated with the ultimate goal of establishing a reliable pattern that could lead to direct engagement. For Mengele, the presence of these operations introduced an invisible pressure, a constant awareness that every corner of his environment might conceal eyes trained on his every action, and that the safety he had assumed for so many years was now under scrutiny. Throughout this period, the psychological impact on Mengele was profound, as the perception of control and invulnerability that had defined his post-war life gave way to anxiety, mistrust, and isolation. The man who had orchestrated acts of control and terror in one context now found himself subject to the meticulous planning and coordination of others, a reversal that underscored both the inevitability of justice and the enduring consequences of his actions. He became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding unnecessary contact, and restructuring his life around the need for security and discretion. Even as he attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy within the expatriate community, the contrast between outward appearances and internal reality was stark. Buenos Aires offered cultural richness and social opportunity, yet the ever-present threat of capture imposed constraints that permeated every aspect of his daily existence. The Mossad's targeting of Mengele after Eichmann's abduction was a calculated escalation, reflecting not only the symbolic importance of capturing one of history's most notorious figures, but also the operational confidence gained from previous successes. Agents operated with a mixture of patience, precision, and adaptability, recognizing that the capture of a man as cunning and elusive as Mengele required both strategic insight and practical ingenuity. The unfolding pursuit illustrated the convergence of historical reckoning and modern intelligence practice, demonstrating how meticulous planning, informed by prior operations and extensive networks, could transform the pursuit of justice into a feasible, though challenging, mission. Each step taken by the Mossad brought them closer to understanding his routines, his network, and the vulnerabilities that might allow them to effectuate an eventual apprehension, turning the abstraction of accountability into a tangible, looming reality. For Mengele, these developments marked a turning point, emphasizing the narrowing margin for error and the shifting balance of power in a life once defined by autonomy and secrecy. The shadow of international pursuit altered every dimension of his existence, forcing him into heightened vigilance and strategic maneuvering, reshaping relationships, daily routines, and perceptions of safety. The targeting by Israeli agents after Eichmann's capture illustrates the persistence of justice across time and borders, the inescapable weight of historical accountability, and the profound impact of coordinated intelligence efforts on individuals who had once believed themselves beyond reach. In this tense interplay of pursuit and evasion, the story of Mengele's flight underscores both the adaptability of human survival instincts and the enduring commitment of those seeking justice to ensure that even the most elusive figures are confronted by the consequences of their actions. The hunt for Josef Mengele in South America was a labyrinthine pursuit, one that tested the ingenuity, patience, and resourcefulness of the Israeli agents tasked with bringing him to justice, and it vividly illustrated the extraordinary difficulties inherent in post-war efforts to track former Nazis who had vanished into the shadows of the continent. Despite the Mossad's rigorous planning and the operational lessons gained from the successful capture of Adolf Eichmann, every lead they followed seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Each surveillance operation ended with tantalizing near misses, and every tip from former Nazi contacts or sympathetic expatriates revealed the tangled web of allegiances and misinformation that protected him. Mengele, aware of the growing danger yet still determined to preserve his fragile freedom, had become a master of camouflage and deception, maneuvering between communities, residences, and temporary safe houses with a careful balance of routine and unpredictability that made him exceedingly difficult to pin down. The agents, operating across Auschwitz, often found themselves following fragments of information, assessing its credibility against the backdrop of a continent where former collaborators, local sympathizers, and even opportunists intermingled, creating a shifting environment in which certainty was elusive and risk ever present. Each surveillance operation brought its own challenges. The agents would stake out residences where Mengele was believed to have spent time, monitor social venues where he might appear, and attempt to intercept communications through intermediaries, all the while ensuring their presence did not compromise the mission or alert him to their interest. Yet for all their expertise, the human element, errors, deceptions, and misdirection played a decisive role. Former Nazis who had once been colleagues of Mengele were invaluable sources, yet they often provided information selectively, sometimes out of loyalty, sometimes out of fear, and occasionally to manipulate outcomes in their own favor. These contacts could suggest a hideout in one city, only for the trail to vanish upon arrival, forcing the agents to reconsider their assumptions and adjust strategies on the fly. Every encounter, every tip, and every observation required meticulous verification, and even the most promising lead could collapse under scrutiny, leaving the searchers navigating a landscape filled with dead ends, false hopes, and the constant awareness that their quarry was always one step ahead. The complexity of the hunt was amplified by the very nature of Mengele's survival strategies. He did not confine himself to a single location or routine. Instead, he frequently relocated, relying on a network of sympathetic contacts who could provide temporary shelter, financial support, and advice on how to evade detection. He understood the importance of blending into the local communities of German expatriates and leveraging shared cultural and ideological affinities to maintain a degree of anonymity. These layers of protection, combined with the natural difficulty of conducting operations in a foreign country with differing laws, customs, and enforcement priorities, created an environment in which the Mossad's intelligence apparatus had to be not only methodical but also extraordinarily adaptable. Even the most diligent surveillance could be thwarted by a simple change in schedule, a misreported address, or the arrival of a new caretaker who knew nothing of the operation. And these small disruptions repeatedly shifted the focus of the hunt, extending its duration and compounding the challenge. Moreover, the passage of time added additional obstacles. As years passed, Mengele's movements became increasingly unpredictable. His network of supporters evolved, and local authorities' attention shifted toward other priorities, sometimes leaving the agents with only intermittent glimpses or fragmented information. The search for a man so notorious yet so mobile highlighted the fundamental tension between the desire for justice and the practical limitations of intelligence operations in an era before advanced digital tracking. Each misstep, each misinterpreted lead, risked the loss of valuable time and resources, and the agents had to constantly reassess their approach, weighing the credibility of every report against the historical, social, and political context in which it emerged. This dynamic created a situation in which persistence, patience, and adaptability were as critical as the actual fieldwork, and the complexity of the hunt became a testament to the extraordinary lengths required to pursue someone determined to remain hidden. The repeated failures to locate Mengele through tips and surveillance also underscored a broader reality. The post-war world was one in which accountability for atrocities was both essential and extremely difficult to enforce when individuals could exploit the dislocations, sympathies, and legal ambiguities of the era. Mengele's ability to evade capture was not simply a product of cunning, but also of the structural and societal conditions of South America, where historical alliances, cultural communities, and political discretion combined to offer a form of protection that frustrated even the most determined agents. Each missed opportunity, Each lead that dissolved into uncertainty highlighted the interplay between individual strategy and systemic factors, revealing a world where justice required not only moral commitment but extraordinary operational skill and perseverance. The story of this pursuit reflects the tension between the inevitability of accountability and the reality of human ingenuity in evasion, demonstrating that the path toward justice is rarely straightforward, often marked by complexity, ambiguity, and relentless determination on both sides. Despite the many frustrations, each near miss, and each failed lead, the agent's efforts were far from futile. Every piece of information gathered, even if did not immediately yield Mengele's location, contributed to a larger mosaic of understanding, mapping the networks, behaviors, and vulnerabilities that could eventually be exploited. The ongoing hunt, shaped by these repeated challenges, became a prolonged testament to the persistence of those committed to confronting historical wrongs, a reminder that even the most elusive figures remain within the reach of methodical, patient, and determined pursuit. Through the repeated failures to pinpoint his whereabouts, the Mossad and allied investigators honed their techniques, refined their understanding of clandestine networks, and strengthened their resolve, ensuring that the complexity of the task itself became a crucial component of the eventual strategy to hold Josef Mengele accountable for his actions, illustrating both the resilience of justice and the extraordinary challenges of hunting a man who had made evasion an art form. As the years passed, the once confident and calculating Josef Mengele found himself increasingly ensnared by the invisible chains of his own paranoia, a psychological weight that transformed his life into a quiet, anxious existence far removed from the social vibrancy and relative comfort he had once enjoyed among German expatriates and fellow former Nazis in Argentina. After evading capture for over a decade, every report of sightings, every rumor of a law enforcement investigation, and every unexpected knock at the door became a potential threat, forcing him to reassess even the simplest of daily routines. In contrast to the urbane life he had cultivated in Buenos Aires, with its cafes, acquaintances, and carefully maintained appearances, his later years in Brazil were characterized by isolation and modesty, an existence dictated not by choice but by necessity, a retreat into a shadowed corner of society where visibility was minimized and suspicion was maximized. The shift was both physical and psychological. His residences became inconspicuous, often small houses or modest apartments, chosen for their ability to blend into ordinary neighborhoods rather than to impress. And his interactions with the outside world were limited to the minimum required for survival, a pattern that spoke volumes about the toll that constant vigilance takes on even the most calculating minds. Mengele's paranoia was reinforced by the knowledge that he was one of the most wanted individuals in the world, a man whose name conjured horror and whose past actions had left an indelible mark on history. The shadow of justice, though delayed, was never far from him, and the stories of Nazi hunters, relentless pursuit stories of Israeli agents meticulously tracking Adolf Eichmann and others, served as an unyielding reminder that no one could claim immunity indefinitely. This ever-present threat shaped his behavior in subtle yet profound ways. He avoided crowded areas, traveled only when necessary, and constantly shifted his locations within Brazil, taking advantage of networks of contacts who, like him, preferred discretion and low visibility. He became adept at navigating local bureaucracies quietly, never attracting attention, and his financial transactions were cautious, structured to avoid leaving traces that could lead back to him. It was a life defined by caution, one where the luxury of confidence and the social ease he once displayed were replaced by careful calculation, constant scanning of his surroundings, and the emotional burden of perpetual fear. The psychological transformation was equally striking. Once a man who had pursued pseudo-scientific ideals with ruthless zeal, using his authority to experiment on the vulnerable and assert a warped vision of racial hierarchy, Mengele now found himself reduced to a state of vulnerability. The power he had wielded at Auschwitz, The authority over life and death that defined his most infamous years had been stripped away, replaced by a gnawing awareness that the world outside his modest refuge could, at any moment, enforce consequences he could no longer avoid. The transition from a man with influence, resources, and social networks to one constrained by fear and secrecy was as profound as it was inevitable. And it mirrored the broader historical arc in which those who perpetrate atrocities may evade justice for a time, but ultimately cannot escape the cumulative weight of accountability, memory, and pursuit. Even as he lived quietly in Brazil, there were reminders of the life he once led, faint echoes of his former social connections, and the remnants of ideological sympathies that persisted in certain expatriate communities. Yet these echoes were insufficient to provide comfort. They were fragments of a past that was increasingly incompatible with the reality of a hunted fugitive. Encounters with acquaintances were rare and carefully orchestrated, and the ease with which he had previously navigated society was replaced by vigilance, observation, and the constant assessment of risk in every interaction. His modest lifestyle, though materially sufficient, was psychologically constraining, an environment where every decision was measured against the possibility of exposure, and every personal connection evaluated for its potential to betray him. It was a life dictated by necessity, where even minor deviations from caution could carry consequences, and where the social ease of youth and ambition was replaced by the enduring, silent tension of survival under the shadow of justice. The moral and historical context of his exile further deepened the irony of his circumstances. Mengele, once a symbol of inhumanity and intellectual arrogance, now existed on the margins of society, removed from the corridors of power and the networks that had once facilitated his work. His retreat into a modest and isolated existence in Brazil highlighted the stark contrast between his previous authority over others and his current vulnerability, offering a quiet but potent commentary on the long arc of justice and historical memory. Whereas his actions at Auschwitz had been public in their horror, documented in testimony and records, his later life was invisible, conducted in secrecy and fear, a life defined not by influence but by evasion, and yet intrinsically linked to the consequences of the past he could never entirely escape. The transformation from a figure of lethal power to a shadowed recluse illustrates both the inevitability of accountability and the profound psychological cost of a life built on cruelty, deception, and the evasion of justice, showing how history can transform even the most infamous individuals into figures defined not by dominance, but by the relentless pressures of conscience, consequence, and concealment. The final chapter of Josef Mengele's life unfolded quietly, far from the chaos of the world he had once sought to dominate, in a manner that was both mundane and revealing of the dramatic contrast between his past and the reality of his end, illustrating the inexorable reach of history and the subtle yet powerful workings of justice over time. In 1979, while swimming in the waters near a small Brazilian town where he had lived in careful seclusion, Mengele suffered a stroke, an event entirely ordinary in its medical occurrence yet extraordinary in its symbolism, marking the sudden cessation of a life that had once been synonymous with cruelty, authority, and terror. The waters that claimed him were neutral, indifferent, and devoid of the spectacle that had characterized his years at Auschwitz or the tense years spent fleeing from international pursuit, and yet they represented the ultimate equalizer, a reminder that even the most notorious figures are bound by the unyielding laws of mortality, no longer capable of manipulating circumstances, evading pursuit, or exerting control over the lives of others. In those moments, he was no longer the angel of death, the man whose name had instilled fear and whose actions had left indelible scars on thousands. He was simply a man confronted with the fragility of the human body, a stark and unavoidable truth that even the most cunning and resourceful cannot escape. The discovery and confirmation of his remains years later became a critical turning point in the historical and moral narratives surrounding Mengele, providing definitive closure to a story that had lingered in uncertainty for decades. For years, rumors and conflicting reports about his whereabouts and potential survival circulated through newspapers. Survivor testimony and investigative networks, fueling myths of a hidden jungle fortress, elaborate escapes, and secretive operations. Yet the reality had been far more ordinary. He had died alone, away from the attention and resources that once facilitated his freedom. Forensic scientists undertook painstaking analysis, examining skeletal remains with the precision of modern science, applying techniques that had advanced dramatically since the time of his flight from Europe. DNA testing, a tool unavailable during his lifetime, provided the conclusive link, matching genetic markers to known relatives and confirming the identity of the remains beyond any reasonable doubt. The combination of forensic evidence and historical records allowed authorities to conclusively close the chapter on Mengele, ensuring that the world could no longer speculate about his continued evasion or create sensationalist narratives that obscured the historical facts of his life and death. This confirmation of death, however, did more than merely resolve a practical concern. It represented a symbolic reckoning with the moral weight of history. For survivors, historians, and legal authorities, the ability to definitively place the end of Mengele's life allowed for a kind of posthumous accountability, a recognition that the man who had orchestrated and conducted horrific experiments, who had exploited the vulnerability of children and families, and who had evaded capture for decades was now beyond the reach of earthly power, yet fully accountable to the historical record. The meticulous nature of the forensic work, blending scientific rigor with investigative diligence, underscored the commitment of modern institutions to ensure that even those who had once escaped justice were ultimately documented and remembered for their deeds, creating a historical closure that, while unable to undo past atrocities, provided a framework for understanding, teaching, and preserving the lessons of the Holocaust and the human capacity for both cruelty and pursuit of justice. The circumstances of his death also revealed the ordinary vulnerabilities that ultimately confront all humans, regardless of their previous power, intellect, or notoriety. Mengele, who had once wielded life and death authority over thousands, who had meticulously designed experiments to manipulate the human body and the natural world, was ultimately subject to the same biological realities that govern every human existence. The stroke, sudden and indiscriminate, deprived him of the control he had exercised for so long, highlighting the ultimate futility of power when faced with forces beyond comprehension or resistance. In this way, his end serves as a profound, if ironic, narrative closure. The man who had attempted to play God over the lives of others was himself rendered helpless, removed from the stage of human affairs, and left only in the record of history. Forensic evidence, and the memories of those who had survived his actions. Moreover, the confirmation of Mengele's death through modern forensic methods exemplifies the intersection of science, law, and moral inquiry in addressing historical crimes, demonstrating how technological advancements can provide clarity, resolution, and accountability even decades after events occur. The DNA testing and skeletal analysis offered not just a scientific confirmation but a form of vindication for the meticulous efforts of investigators, historians, and survivors who had long pursued clarity against uncertainty, rumor, and myth. This convergence of scientific rigor and historical diligence ensured that the narrative of Mengele's life and death could be definitively told, allowing for a more complete understanding of the consequences of his actions and the eventual reach of justice, even when delayed by time and geography. Ultimately, the story of Josef Mengele's final moments, death, and subsequent confirmation through forensic analysis encapsulates a powerful lesson about the arc of human accountability, the limits of power, and the enduring significance of meticulous pursuit of truth. From the horrors of Auschwitz to the quiet isolation of Brazil, and finally to the certainty provided by DNA evidence, the trajectory of his life serves as a reminder that history, science, and morality converge to ensure that even the most elusive figures cannot escape the long shadow of their actions, and that the pursuit of understanding, justice, and remembrance remains a vital endeavor, capable of illuminating the darkest chapters of human history with clarity and resolution. The story of Josef Mengele's experiments at Auschwitz-Birkenau is one that continues to resonate with the darkest recesses of human history, illustrating not only the depths of cruelty that can emerge under ideological fanaticism, but also the enduring resilience of those who survived such horrors, whose lives became living testimony to both human suffering and the need for remembrance. Mengele, known infamously as the Angel of Death, was obsessed with the pseudo-scientific pursuit of a so-called Aryan master race, and his experiments targeted twins in particular, believing that the study of identical pairs would unlock secrets of heredity and genetics that could serve the ideological goals of the Nazi regime. The twins, often just children, were separated from their families, stripped of normalcy, and subjected to a bewildering array of procedures that were both physically excruciating and psychologically traumatic, including injections of chemicals, exposure to extreme temperatures, and invasive surgeries without anesthesia. The sheer scale of this experimentation is staggering. Over 3,000 twins were processed through Mengele's laboratory, yet the survival rate was painfully low, with only about 200 managing to live through the ordeal, a stark reminder of the brutal disregard for human life that characterized the concentration camps. These experiments were not merely clinical studies. They were exercises in control and dehumanization, designed to reduce individuals to objects for observation, to test the limits of human endurance, and to satisfy a warped scientific curiosity that was inseparable from the ideology of hatred underpinning the Third Reich. Survivors recall the terror of being singled out, often because of simple features like hair color, eye color, or birth date, and being forced into situations that no child or indeed any human should ever have endured. They describe the constant fear of inspection, the arbitrary nature of survival, and the cruel delight that some officers took in the suffering of those under their control. Each experiment left an indelible mark, not just physically but emotionally, as children watched siblings and peers suffer and die, confronted with incomprehensible decisions made by a man who claimed authority over life itself. The stories that emerged from this period are heart-wrenching, yet they are essential in understanding the scope of Mengele's atrocities, as they highlight both the meticulous nature of his pseudo-scientific methods and the unrelenting human cost of his obsession with racial ideology. The twin studies, in particular, serve as a grim testament to the perversion of science under totalitarian regimes. Mengele sought to compare each pair, experimenting on one while leaving the other as a control, attempting to document changes with precise measurements, charts, and observations, as if the suffering of children could be reduced to data points. The results, however, were almost entirely irrelevant in terms of legitimate scientific inquiry, because the methods were so fundamentally inhumane that any findings were ethically void and scientifically compromised. Yet, the meticulous record-keeping and the insistence on controlled experiments demonstrate a chilling combination of intelligence and moral corruption, where a capacity for careful observation was twisted into a mechanism for cruelty. This juxtaposition of methodical precision with absolute disregard for human dignity underscores why Mengele's legacy is one that continues to provoke horror, reflection, and the imperative to remember. The impact of these experiments extended far beyond the immediate victims, rippling through families, communities, and future generations. Survivors recount the long-term effects of physical mutilation, chronic illness, and psychological trauma that persisted long after liberation, shaping lives in ways that were permanent and profound. The twin experiments also contributed to a broader narrative of systemic dehumanization, where ordinary people became tools of an ideology that sought to categorize, quantify, and eliminate humanity according to arbitrary criteria of race and purity. Understanding the scale and mechanics of these experiments is crucial not only for historical accuracy but also for grasping the social, ethical, and psychological ramifications of authoritarian regimes that prioritize ideology over human life, offering enduring lessons about vigilance, education, and moral responsibility. Furthermore, the stories of survival among the twins serve as both testament and inspiration. Despite the overwhelming odds and the sheer brutality of the conditions, some individuals endured, maintaining their identity, forging connections with other survivors, and ultimately bearing witness to the atrocities they had experienced. Their testimonies provide invaluable insights into the lived experience of the Holocaust, revealing both the minutiae of daily life under constant threat and the broader mechanisms of Nazi medical experimentation. The courage required to survive these circumstances, coupled with the dedication to share their stories, ensures that the memory of those who perished is preserved and that future generations can learn from the horrors of the past, transforming tragedy into a moral imperative for remembrance, education, and ethical reflection. In recounting the suffering caused by Mengele's experiments, it becomes evident that his legacy is a stark illustration of what can occur when intelligence, authority, and ideology converge without moral constraint, producing consequences that reverberate across time. Over 3,000 twins experienced unimaginable suffering. Yet the resilience of the approximately 200 survivors becomes a testament to human endurance and the importance of historical memory. Their stories, told and retold, remind us that behind every statistic is a human life with hopes, fears, and potential, abruptly disrupted by the cruelty of one man's obsession. This segment of history not only underscores the depth of Mengele's atrocities, but also illuminates the enduring need to confront injustice, uphold human dignity, and educate future generations about the consequences of dehumanization and ideological fanaticism, ensuring that the lessons of the Holocaust remain vivid and unforgotten for all time. As we draw this story to a close, it is impossible to overstate the significance of remembering Josef Mengele and the atrocities he committed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Though he evaded justice in a formal courtroom, disappearing into the shadows of South America and ultimately dying far from the reach of legal accountability, the moral and historical lessons of his actions remain profoundly important. Mengele's life and crimes remind us that the consequences of hatred, dehumanization, and ideological extremism are not confined to the pages of history. They ripple forward through generations, shaping the lives of those who survive and the collective conscience of humanity. The twins and other victims who endured his experiments are living testaments to resilience, courage, and the enduring strength of the human spirit, demonstrating that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, people can bear witness and ensure that the truth is never forgotten. Survivor testimony has been essential in preserving the memory of these events. Those who lived through Mengele's experiments have shared their experiences with historians, educators, and the world at large, transforming personal trauma into lessons that educate and warn future generations. The narratives they offer are vivid, painful, and deeply human, highlighting the individual lives behind the statistics, the relationships and families torn apart, and the psychological scars that linger long after liberation. By listening to these voices, We honor the memory of those who did not survive and reaffirm the principle that humanity must confront evil, even when justice seems delayed or incomplete. Accountability for war crimes extends beyond trials and punishments. It includes the ethical responsibility to remember, to educate, and to challenge ideologies that threaten human dignity. Mengele's story also illuminates the broader challenges of pursuing justice in the aftermath of global conflict, even with international cooperation. Investigative skill and dedicated persistence. Capturing a fugitive who had been adept at evading authorities was extraordinarily difficult. His eventual death, unpunished in a formal sense, illustrates both the limitations of human institutions and the enduring need for vigilance in protecting human rights. Yet, in the absence of a courtroom verdict, history itself acts as a witness, ensuring that the record of his crimes, the suffering endured by his victims, and the lessons drawn from these dark chapters are preserved for posterity. This form of moral reckoning, carried by memory, documentation, and education, reminds us that justice is multifaceted. It is legal, ethical, and historical, and it must be actively maintained to prevent the repetition of such horrors. As we reflect on Mengele's life and the lasting impact of his actions, we are reminded that the power of remembrance is profound. Memory serves not only to honor victims but also to warn the living. In understanding the depth of human cruelty, we are better equipped to recognize the early signs of dehumanization, fanaticism, and the erosion of ethical norms, and to intervene before atrocities occur. Survivor testimonies, museum archives, scholarly research, and public education all contribute to a collective vigilance, ensuring that the past informs our present and shapes a more compassionate future. Each story shared, each fact preserved, and each discussion held about these events reinforces our collective moral responsibility to uphold justice, dignity, and the value of human life. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to learn about this important chapter in history. If you found this video insightful, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it so more people can engage with these lessons from the past. By doing, we contribute to the memory of those who suffered and ensure that history is never forgotten. May the courage and resilience of survivors continue to inspire us all. Good night, and sleep well, knowing that remembering the past helps us build a more just and human future.